Hello, everyone. Welcome to the sixth installment of our High Elevation 5-Needle White Pine 2025-2026 Science and Management webinar series. I'm Enzo Martelli, a PhD student in Kara Nelson's lab at the University of Montana, and I'm your host this month and co-organizer of this series with Karina Lee, master's students at the University of Colorado, Denver, and Luda Lucy, a PhD student in Daniel Ulrich's lab at Montana State University. We have another great presentation for today, a long expected one, and I'd like to start by introducing our board chair, Glenda Scott, who will share a few announcements with us. Welcome, Glenda.
Well, thanks. Nice to be on again. Hope you're having some kind of winter or at least a nice time this summer or this winter and looking forward to summer. It's nice to be on the um, uh, seventh webinar for this school year. Thanks so much to you guys for doing the organization and for our speakers. So I have some new news to our student researchers. We are extending the deadline for the grant proposals till March 1. So each year, the foundation gives out either one or $2,000 to $2,000 grants. And then John Van Gundy, he's often on. Thank you, John, if you are. He does a $1,000 or $2,000 also. So up to three per year. Um, the ones coming from the foundation are Research in High Five Ecosystems, Canada and US. So there's lots of leeway. Please consider that. It may be just that extra boost you need to get your research done. Van Gundy Fund is High Five Dynamics Under Climate Change. So just a little bit of a twist. But hopefully, please think of that those needs. We only have one proposal right now, so you have a good chance if you'll get your proposal in by March 1. And that is a new date. That's an extension. I know that we'll be getting that on social media. There is the request for proposal is on our website, and that's going to be dropped into our message box from Julie. So I invite you to submit your proposals. Look for 2026 student grant, RFP. And I'm not sure if everyone on the screen right now has been a grant recipient, but I know a number of you have. So um, we look forward to your participation. Then another announcement is if you did not receive Nutcracker notes in January, Enzo was the guest editor, did a wonderful job. If you do not receive that in your email, that means that you need to renew your membership. It's time. So please renew your annual membership. And if you would like to be a new member, please join the foundation. And we have that membership page is also going up on the chat box. I think Julie's going to be putting it on. And the other thing that I want to ask kindly is that there's a saying that says no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And I guess what we invite you to do is if you can make a donation to the Whitebark Pine Foundation to support the work like this webinar, who many of you attend monthly. If you can make a small donation, that will gather up and be a significant donation that helps us with our programs, such as the ski area, the webinar, the Nutcracker notes, the conference, all that kind of stuff. So lots of cool stuff, and of course, it all needs your help. So if you can do that, we would really appreciate it. And that's also easily found on our website. Last thing I want to ask you for is your talents. We're looking for diverse backgrounds, experience, knowledge to get involved with the foundation. Either on the board, we have some people retiring off, and also on committees. If you want to test out the flavor of things before you get on the board, please do. And you can contact me, you can contact Julie, Executive Director, or any one of our board members. We have a lot of different events and ways for you to be involved. So we are asking for your talents. And the last thing is events coming up. If you're going to be in the Whitefish area or Crystal Park ski area, we're having some ski area education events. Please support the foundation, share the knowledge and information about Whitebark, the Whitebark Pine story at these ski areas. Expect to see some Earth Day tables around the valley. And in September, South Lake Tahoe is the location of our conference. So be on the lookout for that. I think it's the third week of September. So with that, um, I will close that out and turn it over. I'm looking forward to Karen's insights. It's something that we're waiting on bated breath now that it's been the Whitebark's been listed as threatened. We're anxious to hear where that takes us and where we are in the process. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. Have a good spring.
Thanks for joining us today, Glenn, as well. And if you miss any of our previous installments, you can find the recordings of the talks on our YouTube channel, Whitebark Flicks. The link on our website will be posted in the chat briefly in a second. And finally, after the presentations, we will have a Q&A session where you can share all your comments, doubts, and questions. Please post them on the chat box, and our team will be collecting them. And without further ado, let me introduce you to our today's speakers. Karen Newlon has been a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service since 2015, and she currently serves as the regional project manager in the Service Mountain-Prairie Region, where she leads interdisciplinary teams through species status assessment, recovery planning, and 5-year status reviews for listed species. Karen has worked with the Whitebark pine since 2018 as a member of the core team that developed the species status assessment informing its listing determination. And she is now part of the Whitebark pine recovery team, contributing to the development of the species recovery plan. Her work focuses on advancing science-based recovery strategies in close coordination with federal, state, tribal, and partner organizations. Karen is based out of the Montana Ecological Services Field Office in Helena, Montana. And with that, I'll leave it to Karen. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be a participant in the webinar as opposed to just a viewer. I am going to share my screen. Apologies for my Zoom naivety here. Let me just 1 second here. And then I'll go ahead and do this, and I think that should work. So, as Enzo said, I am a regional recovery project manager for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I work out of our Mountain-Prairie Regional Office, but I'm actually located in Helena, Montana. And I, at first when I was approached to
Really quick,
yes.
sorry to interrupt you. If your video isn't your screen sharing's not working.
Oh no.
I know we just
It
practiced.
just worked. I apologize. Let me see here. How about that?
It's doing something.
How about that?
Yay, there it is.
Okay, that was user error, I'm
Thank
sure,
you.
on my part.
Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So when I was approached to give a webinar, I thought, well, what would be useful to folks? What new information can I provide on whitebark pine? So this presentation will be a little bit different than what we usually hear in these talks. I wanted to kind of go over the history of federal actions, in terms of the Endangered Species Act and whitebark pine. I wanted to give an overview of the Fish and Wildlife Service's Species Status Assessment, or our SSA framework. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the SSA report that was used to inform the listing determination, but I wanted to kind of just give a background of how we develop SSAs. And then I'll talk about the listing determination itself for whitebark pine. I'll then move into the service's recovery planning framework and then give an update on where we are with recovery planning for whitebark pine. So we were first petitioned to list the whitebark pine under the ESA in February 91, so 35 years ago. And for that first petition, we determined that the petition did not provide substantial information that listing was warranted for whitebark pine. So that was sort of the end of that for that first petition. We received a second petition 17 years later. And in that petition, we did find that it presented substantial information that listing of the species was warranted under the ESA. So with that, we published a 12-month finding in 2011. And in that finding, we determined that listing of whitebark pine was warranted, but precluded by higher priority actions. So at that point, we added whitebark pine to our list of candidate species, and whitebark pine was a candidate species for several years. While it was a candidate species, we undertook a species status assessment, and that was used to inform the listing determination, and we completed a first version of that species status assessment in 2018. So I do want to give some detail about our species status assessment, or our SSA framework. We've been using SSAs to inform various ESA decisions for about a decade now, maybe a little bit longer. And SSAs serve as our analytical framework to assess the condition of a species, both currently and into the future. The SSA describes the viability of the species in a way that supports our ESA decisions. In the SSA, we define a species viability as the ability of a species to maintain populations in the wild over time. And we evaluate species viability using the 3 conservation biology principles of resiliency, redundancy, and representation. So in our SSAs, we define resiliency as the ability of populations to withstand environmental and demographic stochasticity, as well as periodic disturbances within the normal range of variability. So to evaluate resiliency, we're considering metrics such as population abundance, different measures of productivity. We're also considering the connectivity among populations. For redundancy, we define that as the ability of a species to withstand catastrophic events. So with redundancy, we're evaluating the number of populations and how those populations are distributed across the species range. We're also considering the scale of a species relevant catastrophe. So, we're then relating the catastrophe and how that relates to the distribution, the spatial distribution of the populations, and how it can impact population structure. And then for species representation, we define that as the ability of a species to adapt to both near-term and long-term changes in its environment. So this is also known as adaptive capacity. And when we're evaluating representation for the species, we're considering the diversity of the species in terms of its genetic diversity, its ecological diversity, phenotypic diversity, behavioral diversity. We're also considering the dispersal ability of the species, and we can also consider potentially its ability to colonize new areas. And so, these 3 principles aren't evaluated in isolation. They are assessed and integrated across multiple scales and used to in our evaluation of overall species viability. Species status assessments, we have 3 main stages in the SSA. The first stage is really that biological background information. We describe the species habitat and demographic needs. We describe the resources needed to complete individual life cycles, the habitat quantity and quality needed to support the species. We also define the units of analysis at which we're assessing the species. So, for some species, we may actually be able to define biological populations. Often we cannot. So we do define some relevant unit of analysis to conduct the SSA. We also describe what is needed for population resilience for the species. And then the second stage of the SSA is our evaluation of current conditions for the species. So in this section, we are describing the current availability of those species needs that we described in the first stage. We're also describing the stressors that are impacting those species needs that we described, and evaluating how those stressors and also how any existing conservation efforts may be impacting resiliency of the units of analysis. So for instance, in the whitebark pine SSA, we considered 4 main stressors that were impacting the species at the population level: white pine blister rust, altered fire regimes, mountain pine beetle, and climate change. The third stage of the SSA framework is our evaluation of future conditions for the species. So here we're using that current conditions analysis as sort of our baseline. We then develop future scenarios that sort of bracket the range of plausible futures for the species in terms of the availability, again, of the species needs. We also project the future effects of conservation efforts, project future changes in the stressors to those, and the effects of those stressors on the future needs of the species. And we do that over a biologically meaningful time frame. So obviously that will differ depending on the species. And when we're considering a time frame, we consider not only the time frame that the influences are operating under, but we're also considering the time frame needed for the species to respond to those influences. So for whitebark pine, for instance, our foreseeable or our biological time frame actually went quite far into the future because of the long generation times for the species. So I mentioned that we develop analysis units to evaluate the species status. In our whitebark pine SSA, we delineated analysis units based on level 3 ecoregions that were modified to some degree with input from species experts. And really these ecoregions can serve as a proxy for populations in our SSA analysis. And we assume that the analysis units represent potential local adaptations across the species range. So within our species status assessment, we clearly state our assumptions, and we also incorporate relevant uncertainty. Particularly, in some cases, we don't have a lot of quantitative information. So some of our analysis may have to be more of a qualitative assessment. And again, when we're developing our future scenarios and developing projections of future conditions, obviously that has some degree of uncertainty. So we make sure to incorporate those uncertainties and state those uncertainties within the SSA. The SSA report, which is sort of the end product of the SSA process, does undergo an independent peer review, and we do address all peer review comments and incorporate them as appropriate. And the important thing about the SSA and what makes it such a useful document is that it's designed to be updated over time as we get new information. So it is never considered a final report. It is a living document designed to be updated. And because of that, we can use it to inform multiple ESA programs. So initially, when we initially started using the SSA framework, it was primarily used in a listing decision context. But since that time, we've used SSAs to inform multiple ESA programs, including recovery planning. We also use them to inform our 5-year status reviews for listed species. And the information in the SSA, the biological information, the discussion of the stressors and how those stressors impact the needs of the species is also useful in our Section 7 consultation context as well. So it really does have a broad usage across the ESA programs. So getting back to the listing determination, we published a proposed rule to list whitebark pine as a threatened species in 2020. So at that point, its status was proposed threatened. We received many public comments on the proposed rule. We also revised the SSA. There was considerable new information from when we had completed the first version of the SSA until up until the point where it was the proposed rule was out. So we went ahead and revised the SSA as well as addressed public comment and published the final rule to list whitebark pine as a threatened species in 2022. We also finalized a rule under Section 4D of the ESA. So this is known as a 4D rule. And that 4D rule provides for the conservation of whitebark pine by prohibiting several activities, including import or export of the species into or out of the country, any interstate sale of the species, any interstate transport of the species, any damage, destruction, removal or reduction to possession, which is a ESA terminology, on federal lands. An important point here, unlike wildlife species, there are no take prohibitions for listed plant species under the ESA. So some of these prohibitions apply to whitebark pine only on federal lands. There may be instances where there may be a state endangered species law. And in that case, those prohibitions would apply to whitebark pine outside of federal lands in those states. But primarily, the prohibitions apply to the whitebark pine on federal lands, which is quite different than how we usually think about prohibitions for listed species. There are several exceptions to those prohibitions. Exceptions include activities authorized by a permit. So, for example, we have what we call Section 10A1A permits. These are related to enhancement of survival of the species, so that would include propagation. There are research-related permits. Other exceptions include forest management and restoration activities that are conducted and authorized by federal agencies on federal lands. And we also included exceptions for collection of whitebark pine seeds by members of federally recognized tribes. We did not designate critical habitat for whitebark pine. We determined that habitat was not the limiting factor in the status of whitebark pine. Instead, the main driver of the species status was white pine blister rust primarily. And so we determined that the designation of critical habitat wouldn't provide additional conservation benefit. And then once we published that final rule, we also developed a recovery outline. And that serves as sort of interim guidance on kind of the immediate conservation needs of the species, and also kind of provides a potential roadmap to what recovery planning for the species might look like. It also acknowledges all the existing conservation efforts that have been ongoing for the last several decades for whitebark pine as well. So I'm going to transition into discussions of recovery planning. So under the ESA, we are statutorily required to develop a recovery plan for listed species. But saying that, recovery plans are not themselves regulatory documents. They are guidance documents only, and they outline the strategy to recover the species. So there's nothing in a recovery plan that creates any legal or financial obligation. And although, we typically have participation and assistance in the development of recovery plans from other agencies, outside of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The recovery plans themselves do not represent any official position or approval by any other agency other than the Fish and Wildlife Service. And recovery plans require approval and signature by our regional director, and only at that point do they represent the official position of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So getting that all out of the way. The ESA itself, actually, although sort of the whole goal of the ESA is to recover listed species, it actually doesn't define recovery. Instead, it defines conserve, and that's sort of the whole mission of the ESA, is to conserve habitats for listed species and use all methods and procedures to bring species to the point to a point where they no longer need the protections of the Act. So the regulatory definition of recovery, the regulatory definition of recovery sort of interprets that conservation definition. And so in other words, we can consider a species to be recovered when it no longer meets the definition of a threatened or endangered species. And one important point is that any decision to revise a species status is based on an analysis of the best available science, and regardless of whether or not that information differs from what is in the recovery plan, which leads into the service's three-part recovery planning framework. So this is a relatively recent framework that the service has adopted. In the past, recovery plans, if you're familiar with other historical recovery plans, they're really long documents. They have all of that sort of background biological information, an in-depth discussion of the threats to the species and the effects of the threats on the species and the current status of the species. All of that historically has been included in the recovery plan itself. And when we've done that in the past, the recovery plan risks becoming outdated. With our SSA framework, we can now pull all of that foundational science information, that discussion of stressors, the evaluation of current conditions, all of that can now go in our SSA report. And again, that document is designed to be updated. So really that recovery plan itself can just focus on the overall strategy of species recovery. Again, the recovery plan itself must be approved by the regional director, as well as it must go out for public review and comment. And so focusing that recovery plan on the recovery actions and that overall recovery strategy, and keeping the biological information in that separate SSA report. And then the third separate document as part of this framework is the recovery implementation strategy. So in that, I'll call it the RIS, we love acronyms. The RIS is really the kind of who, what, when, where, how of implementing recovery actions. So again, this RIS is the operational plan. It does not require approval by the regional director, and it does not require public review and comment. And that really provides us the flexibility to update that implementation strategy as often as we need to. As we're implementing recovery, as we learn more, we can easily adapt our recovery activities, and keeping those in separate documents from the recovery plan really gives us a lot more flexibility. So in thinking about the recovery plan itself, it really, statutorily, we're only required to include 3 elements in a recovery plan: recovery criteria, recovery actions, and estimates of time and cost. The recovery criteria are just the conditions that would indicate a species is recovered. So really, in total, they are what the recovered state would look like for the species. The recovery actions are the site-specific management actions needed to achieve those recovery criteria. And then the third element of the recovery plan are estimates of time and costs, or the total time and costs needed to achieve recovery. So going a little deeper into those statutory elements, we are required to develop objective and measurable recovery criteria. Since we've been using the three-part framework, we can use the information in that SSA report to help us develop those recovery criteria thresholds. We can consider those criteria in terms of resiliency, redundancy, and representation. Those recovery criteria then can provide a means by which to measure progress towards recovery. So often they'll include a key metric of species viability, for instance, population abundance, or some reliable measure of reproduction. They also typically include a threshold of a metric that would signify recovery. In some cases, that might be a specific number of individuals, if we have that kind of information. Oftentimes, it's maybe an increasing trend over a specified time frame. And then for some species, it's appropriate to have a recovery criteria related to the reduction or elimination of an existing threat. For instance, there may be an instance where removal of a dam would be a recovery criteria. And when that dam was removed, that would indicate a recovered state for the species. We're all well aware that the threats facing whitebark pine are probably not able to be eliminated. So the focus really for whitebark pine will be increasing that resiliency, and what are the measures of resiliency of the species that would indicate a recovered condition. So the second statutory element, again, are those recovery actions. These are site-specific management actions needed to achieve the recovery criteria. Site-specific could be if we had, something that was applicable at the population level, that could be incorporated. Sometimes it's more appropriate to apply recovery actions at the species range level. Recovery actions, they should be flexible enough to allow us to adapt as we get new information. They should provide enough context that we can understand what the action is doing without having to refer to that recovery implementation strategy. But it is a balance. We don't want them so broad that they're not particularly useful, not really saying much, but we also don't want all of that detail about how we're going to implement the actions to be included here, because again, that might change over time. So we want to keep that sort of operational detail in that recovery implementation strategy. So the third statutory element then are the estimates of time and cost. And I emphasize the word estimates here. These are challenging, obviously, to develop. We need to consider the time it takes to complete all of the recovery actions. We need to consider the time needed for the species to respond to those recovery actions. We need to consider the time needed to document the species responses and the species recovery. How long do we need to monitor? When are we done? We also need to estimate the costs to implement the recovery actions, and those are estimated in current dollars. So we don't account for inflation. So this is probably the biggest estimate for us in terms of recovery planning, but we are able to draw from existing plans, gain expertise from other partners that have experience implementing some of these recovery actions. And so then that can go into our overall estimates of cost to implement the recovery actions. So the third part of that recovery planning framework is that recovery implementation strategy. This is our on-the-ground implementation of the recovery actions, the who, what, when, where, how of how recovery actions will be implemented. This is when, by keeping it in a separate document, this is our easily updatable plan. We can easily incorporate new information. We can easily adapt. We can update it as often as necessary. It also identifies potential recovery partners, and it contains the recovery activities that link directly to the recovery actions in the recovery plan. So having that risk separate from the recovery plan itself really reduces the need for recovery plan revisions because of the approval requirements and the requirement to get public review and comment. They can be relatively static documents, the recovery plans, but by again keeping the activities separate, we can focus on updating that risk document and not be as concerned about the recovery plan itself becoming outdated. And now we're working towards recovery of whitebark pine. So when we listed whitebark pine in 2023, when the final rule became effective, we realized that this was a different species for us. It's a complex species. It's a wide-ranging species. There are still many, many, many millions of individuals on the landscape. The stressors are complex and acting at different levels across the range. They're stressors that we can't do much about. And so we realized that, this was sort of a whole new world for us in the ESA world. So we determined that we needed help. And so we did develop a formal whitebark pine recovery team. The members are formally appointed by our regional director. And the role of the recovery team members is to assist and advise the service on aspects of recovery. Members are not participating or not invited based on their affiliation, but rather based on their expertise. So they are providing their individual expertise. They're not part of the team based on any sort of agency affiliation. And several of the recovery team members developed topic-specific working groups because there are so many nuanced issues with whitebark pine and the interactions of the stressors and the complicated management needs and restoration needs facing the species. We developed topic-specific working groups. And so then that allowed us to even reach out even further in terms of getting more expertise from outside individuals. So they're not members of the working group, aren't necessarily members of the recovery team, but they do provide us with additional expertise to develop recovery actions and activities for the species to incorporate into the recovery plan. So this is a list of the recovery team members. There have been a couple of retirements since we established the team, but I just did want to take this time to express my gratitude with this team. They've the passion for the species and for the conservation of the species has been inspiring, and I have learned so much about the the decades of work that have gone into conservation of the species. And it's been a real pleasure working with this team and gaining from their expertise and insights as we work through recovery plan development. So about that recovery plan, what is going on? Well, we are working on it. We have been working on the draft. We also have a draft of the recovery implementation strategy as well, and are still working with the formal recovery team to get their input and to make sure, have we thought of everything? Is there anything that we've missed? And so once that draft plan has been approved by our regional director, it will go out for public comment. We no longer publish notices in the Federal Register for recovery plans. Instead, we have a website where we make the draft plans available. But not to worry, there will be extensive outreach when that plan is available for comment. I think the comment periods are typically about 60 days. But so don't worry, you won't miss it. You'll definitely know when it's available. And although we aren't required to have the risks available, we will. That's our best practice here in the Mountain-Prairie region, is to have the risks available as a supporting document to that recovery plan, so you kind of get the complete picture of what recovery planning looks like for whitebark pine. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Karen. We're pretty much at the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. But to anyone who still has any burning questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll capture them. We'll send them to Karen, and she'll continue to graciously address our endless curiosity on this topic. And then our next webinar series will be on March 17th. Featuring Jeremy Greenberg, a recent master's student from the University of British Columbia and board member of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada. Jeremy will be presenting his research on the effects of fire and fire surrogates on whitebark pine in Glacier National Park, British Columbia. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and stay tuned for our upcoming installments. And thanks again, Karen. Have a great rest of your day.